Hi everybody, my name is Jonathan Woodward. I'm a graphic designer and I'm currently making the transition from full-time graphic design to full-time illustrator. I have a blog that I'm using to chart my progress and also that I'm hoping will become a really good resource to other aspiring illustrators making the move into the profession. And that blog is 0toillo.com, 0 Z-E-R-O, the number 2 I-L-L-O.com, 0toillo.com. Now what we're doing today is following a digital painting I did recently of some wolves. The piece itself took about 3.5 hours from start to finish, and as you can see it's sped up to about 3 times the speed here. The tools I'm using I'm using Photoshop CS3, although the version doesn't matter because I'm using quite basic functionality. Also using a Wacom Bamboo tablet, which is the cheapest tablet in the Wacom range, and I find it functions perfectly well. You can go for the more expensive Intuos or even the Cintiq range, but for me this works very well, and it's very small and very portable, so it works well with my lifestyle. Okay, I'm basically using just a hard-edged round brush. The pen pressure is set to pressure on the tablet, and just lower the opacity and gives you a nice sketchy feel. The harder you press, the darker the line and the thicker the line, so it acts very much like a normal pencil would. So I did a Google search, found some nice pictures of wolves that I liked, 4 or 5 images, and pieced those together in my head to form a composition that I thought would work quite well. The piece is going to be, it's almost like a sketchbook page, so I'm not looking for a high degree of finish. I just wanted something that's quite loose, more expressive, and hopefully got a bit of life into it as well. There's no point in really just trying to replicate the photo, because the photo already exists. So we're going for something a little bit more expressive. Now, what I do first of all is start to just sketch in the forms of the wolves. As you can see, these top wolves are giving me a bit of a problem. Just trying to get those right before I go any further. It's very important to do that because if your drawing's bad, if it doesn't work, then no matter how much rendering you put in, you might do this amazingly rendered fur. If the actual drawing itself isn't right, then it's just not going to work. So it's worth spending time and erasing and starting again and working into them to get it right at this stage. As you can see, this wolf in the middle here, a technique I often use if something's not working, if I'm trying to draw an outline and it just can't capture the form right, I'll block in a darker tone. I always find it easier to work light on dark sometimes to get the forms right. So if you just block in some grey, and you'll see in a moment I do this with the wolf on the left as well, because he wasn't working, block in some grey and then start picking out the highlights to create the form, rather than trying to draw the outline of the wolf. It really does help to look at it in a different way. It gives you a fresh perspective and you're just picking out different values rather than the outline. So once we have the basic drawing done, we're just sketching very loosely a bit of detail, doing in a little bit more on the eyes, and just picking out things so that you're ready to move into the next stage. And once we've got the composition down and the basic sketch of the wolves in, I like to bring a bit of texture in. I don't really like working just on a white piece of paper, whether it's when I'm working traditionally or I'm working on the computer. I like to sort of mess up the page, and that can be, just spilling your coffee on it, anything. In this case, I've got some fur texture, and I just plonk that in the background on its own layer, set the layer to multiply, and just lower the opacity, stick it behind the sketch, and then it gives you a nice platform to work on. I don't also like having the solid texture there. There's too much hair there in the background, and it's not working, it's actually distracting. So I choose a nice brush. There's some nice brushes called Cosmic Turmoil, and you get some really nice smoky effects with those. I think it's from a website called Brush Easy, and that's BRUSHEEZY.com, brusheasy.com. It's a nice set called Cosmic Turmoil, so if you have a look at that, it's a free set, so you can download that and use it yourself. Very good for clouds as well as smoke and that sort of thing, but also to give you a nice edge when you're erasing bits and pieces. Okay, so we're back now to the hard round brush, and we just are starting to set in some of the values of the piece, just to pick out the forms and get some of these values correct before we go any further. Helps to pick out the function, and you can sort of see a little more where you're going with that. One point to make about layers. I don't like to use too many layers, 4 or 5 at the most, and as I go along I'll keep collapsing those layers as I go and merging them so that we're not working on too many and it gets too complicated. And I try to do that, I force myself to do it rather than have lots of different layers and working on each one individually, and then it just ends up with too many layers, but it also forces you to try and be a little bit more confident in the marks that you're making. There are certain artists like Marko Đurđević, I always get his name, pronunciation is pretty tricky, Marko Đurđević, and he does a lot of covers for Marvel. And he only worked on one layer. If something's not working, he'll just paint over it. So he works very much in a traditional way, but digitally, and he works fantastic. But he's got obviously such confidence in the marks that he's making that he can now just go straight in, one layer. If something's not working, he'll paint on top of it and just work into it like a traditional painting. It takes time to get there, and hopefully one day I'll be that confident. But at the moment, I'd say keep it to about 3 or 4 layers. Okay, so as you can see, I'm just starting to pick out a few more of the details, going in with the darks. I usually work dark to light. It helps me to create the forms a little more. Some people work light to dark. I find that quite tricky, but you're just finding a method that works for you, really. One thing I like about working from dark to light is I love that bit at the end where you start putting the real highlights, and it really brings the piece to life and makes it pop. But at the moment we're just picking out some of these darker values to create some more of the form. It doesn't need to be that neat at this stage. We're trying to keep the marks quite expressive, so we're just at the moment just blocking in details, or loose details, just to get the forms right. I'm basically working in a number of passes. So basically the first pass was to get the sketch done, the second pass put some texture in and block some of the tones in, and then this stage that I'm doing now, rather than working too heavily on one area and getting it to a finished degree, you'd end up then with a piece that it looks quite unbalanced. The parts of it will be super detailed and some of it will be very loose. That can be okay, I mean, and certain times that actually works better. But what I'm trying to do here is spend the same amount of time on the details in each sort of pass of detailing that I do. So I'll do the same amount of rendering on each of the walls before I move to the next level, and then do some more detailing, then the next level and the next level until the piece is finally finished. So as you can see here, just starting to put in the teeth very loosely, just to give you an idea of how the piece will look. A little bit more detailing there just to pick the teeth out, and that gum at the top where the wolf's rearing it's showing its gums and teeth. I'm trying to, especially with this wolf down here, trying to create some of the energy and the sort of bristling aggression that it's got with the hair standing up on the back of his neck. So this is again where the loose expressive marks come in. And start to block in some of the areas, the harder edge areas like the noses. Just helps you to pick out some of those details a little bit more. So you can see putting the eyes in is quite an important part, and really it makes the piece start to come to life. Now what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to, although my marks are very loose at this stage, not very detailed, and they're quite a big brush I'm using, I'm trying to block in the fur and in the direction that it is, so that the marks I'm making are starting to look like fur. So as I go in with the detailing there's different levels of detail, and it just helps to create a bit more life into the piece rather than just trying to use one texture brush to draw the fur. So a bit more detail up here. Trying to make this wolf look less pig-like. Its nose turned out a bit piggy-like, which I wasn't keen on. So working into to try and make this work a bit better. Still looking a little bit piggy-like, but starting to get the form right a little bit now. Again, erasing bits if they're not working, and just working back into them again to get that shape right. So important to do this before you get too carried away and too far into the piece. Make sure it's working. It's a lot trickier to change things later on down the line. Although this being digital, it's still so much easier than if you were to do a traditional piece and had to make those changes, which is why it's so popular with concept art, just to turn things around very quickly, make amendments to them, and a lot of illustrators work digitally these days. Even a lot of people like John Foster, who is an amazing oil painter. He works primarily digitally now, carrying those oil sensibilities into software like Coral Painter, and but it allows him to do his work in such a smaller amount of time, which means it's great for when he's got tight deadlines rather than waiting for oil paint to dry. But it's amazing that he carries the same look. I mean, a lot of pieces you couldn't tell whether they were oil or whether they were done digitally. It's pretty amazing. So just blocking in again some of the values for this wolf, just to get them so they're all sort of evenly done before I go into the next level of detail. And this little guy was looking a bit fox-like. I think I sort of figured out that it was his nose, really, so I needed to broaden his nose a little bit. Again, putting the eyes in really helps to bring the piece to life. And it's amazing putting the eyes in sometimes. You can really sort of highlight areas where things aren't looking right. So that's very much looking quite sketchy still. And still, I suppose it's sort of, although I'm blocking in some of the tones and values, it's still quite a sketchy stage that we're at. And one thing I've learned with digital, I'll often go through a phase where I'm thinking, oh no, this looks really awful. And rather than carrying on and working into it, I'll often start again or give up, thinking it's not right. But I have to sort of constantly remind myself that it's going through those different levels, like the first pass of detail, and then the second pass and the third pass, and eventually the piece really comes to life. So just stick with it and keep working into it. Providing your source, your first drawing is right, then you should be fine. And just have fun and try different techniques, really, putting different textures in and using different brushes. Just have fun and go crazy, because it can just be deleted. And start again, erase a layer, and that's where it's great when you've got the layers, because you can just try something on a layer. If it doesn't work, just get rid of it. Or even leave those layers in, lower the opacity, and it should all add a bit of extra texture and richness to your piece. That's one thing I'm not keen on, the work that looks obviously digital. I much prefer the look, which is why I sort of rave about John Foster, because his work is so nice. Here, just keep flipping your image is a good way to highlight certain areas where things aren't looking right. But yeah, John Foster, I really like his work because it doesn't look computer generated. It's very much looks like his oil work. Okay, so I'm merging some layers here, and one technique that I like to do is when I've got it to a certain stage, I'll copy and paste the layer on top, copy and paste the flattened drawing, the work so far, and paste it on top, set that layer to multiply, and rather than adjusting levels, it gives you a nice darker, richer piece to work into. Lower that opacity so that it's not 100%, because otherwise it's going to be too dark. But as you can see, it's given it a lot more depth that I can then go in on that layer and start working on some of the highlights. And I'm using a brush here. It's called Texture Comb, I think, and it's quite nice, like a rake almost. And when I zoom in a moment, you'll be able to see what it looks like. But it's a really good way of representing the fur. And again, like I was saying before, give some nice expressive marks, and rather than drawing each individual bristle of fur, it gives you a nice broad, like a flat-tipped brush with a lot of the paint wiped off, and so you're sort of scraping it on almost like a little comb. So a really nice little effect it gives. And choosing the brush for your piece is really important, and just have fun. But try and choose brushes that are going to work well for the type of surface or material you're trying to represent. In this case, fur, and so this brush worked really well. Here you can see the brush tip here, which is really nice to represent the fur. Keeping the opacity, I'm using white as the colour, but keeping the opacity really low at the moment so I can build things up. So you don't want to put too much of a highlight in until the very end, which you can use to then make a piece really pop, stand out. Too many highlights and then the whole value range has gone, so you don't want to have too many middle tone areas, otherwise the piece will just look washed out and grey. So be sparing with when you're putting the tone in. So although I was working on highlights, I'm also going back in and putting some dark in there as well, some dark tones. You can see those marks that I made earlier, they're starting to get obliterated by the other textures I'm putting on top, the other marks I'm putting on top, but you can still see them, they still come through, which gives it a really nice sketchy feel. And also in the long run, because you can see those marks through the marks I'm putting down now, it just helps to build up more of a richness. Especially working with something like fur, which is such a complex form, but you need to break it down into almost like clumps. So just putting in a bit more of a dark here. Try not to be too heavy-handed with this brush, but just enough so it gets a bit of energy into the piece. And using brushes like this, you can have some really happy accidents. That sort of fur around here on the neck where it's clumped thick fur and it separates. By just using this brush, I didn't set out to use this brush to do this particular area. But it was just working, and it was just a happy accident, which you can have by just altering your brush that you're using to try different things and see what works. And it worked quite well in capturing that fur that's separated and clumped, and then just going in and adding some highlights, and it's a nice little effect. Picking out some more highlights, dotting the brush around as well, especially this type of brush works really well to create the fur. just a random nature of the fur, which you can capture to an extent by putting the fur texture in. You can see it's a little bit too heavy, the texture, the fur texture that I put in underneath the piece at the very beginning, and so I'm actually obliterating a lot of that out. You can see around the nose of the sort of snout of the wolf at the top in the middle that the direction of the fur is showing through from the texture a little bit too much, so I will need to go into that and knock it back a little bit. But I'll knock it back by using this comb brush now to do that, rather than lowering the opacity of the texture. I've actually removed that layer anyway, or flattened that layer now, so I couldn't go in and do it. So again, it's just working on top of existing layers, flattening the layers as you go along. Forces you to go in and work into the piece rather than just lowering opacity of other layers. See here, so I'm just getting rid of some of that fur. The direction of that fur is not really working with the piece, so just block it out with this white comb brush with low opacity. So zooming in and out is also a really useful method of checking that the piece is working. You can get carried away zooming in onto a specific area to work on it, and I'm forgetting to zoom in and out, then you zoom out at the end and realise that the balance of the piece is just all off. So keep zooming in and out, rotating the piece, flipping the piece. All helps you notice those bits in the illustration that aren't working. So here I realised that the wolf's eyes were a little bit too large, and also too low down, and it's something that's been bothering me, so I thought I need to go and do this now rather than waiting until I get too far in. So just a little adjustment. You may not think it makes that much difference, but for me it just wasn't working right. So I just copied and pasted a selection of the eyes, and then just use an eraser with a soft edge this time, just to blur out around the edges, and it doesn't take a few minutes just to do that, but to me it made a big difference to the piece. So I've actually flattened the image so far and added a new layer here called hard edges, and this is just for the hard edges around the mouth, the nose, the teeth, and around the eyes, where I just wanted to block in some of those areas a little bit more and pick them out, and then with that being on a new layer I could always lower the opacity, so if it was looking a bit too harsh I could knock that back a little more. So it's just that next pass of detailing to pick out these areas. Again, when you're doing these sort of things, remember to zoom in and out, just to make sure that you're not being too heavy-handed. And if you are, you could either paint over or you could lower the opacity. So once we've got the darks in, you can start to put a few little highlights in. You want to avoid using pure white or 100% white right until the very end, and use it very sparingly. Otherwise, using too much of it, the piece will look flat. It's like having too many mid-tone greys. Having too many highlights, you lose the impact of that highlight. And so just whitening the eyes up a little bit there, just to bring it to life. To see on the bottom lip of this wolf, I'm going in with a highlight, but not a really white highlight yet, just to get the impression that it's a shiny surface. So again, we just go in and Do the hard edges on the nose. Let's pick out the mouth a little bit more. Putting a few basic highlights in and some more darks, just to pick out the form of the nose a little bit more. You can see that sort of thing makes a huge difference to the piece. And the eyes, I love putting the eyes in. Don't go too crazy on the eyes yet. Just to pick those out a little bit more, and then you zoom out and you really see the impact of that. Okay, still working on this nose, trying to make it less pig-like. If you're having problems with a certain area of an illustration, it's often not a good idea to dwell on it, just really try and force it into working. Just move on to another piece, another section of the illustration and work on that, and then come back to it. Sometimes it's like flogging a dead horse, it's just not going right no matter what you do. So move on to another piece, another bit of the illustration, and then come back to it. And you'll often find that whether it's just because you've warmed up more by working on another bit of the illustration, you come back to it and you get it, nail it first time. So. Doing this nose now. Really glad that I enlarged the nose. It really was looking very fox-like rather than wolf-like. And looking at my reference, I could see it was the nose that was causing that. So although this is a juvenile wolf and it's a bit smaller and skinnier, it was the nose that was making it look like a fox. You can see here around the ears how well that comb brush works. Just by laying in a few strokes, he really starts to hint that it's fur there rather than just a mass of smooth object. Back in with the comb brush, texture comb. Just sculpting form of this wolf's mouth. And a few more highlights, obliterating some of that texture underneath, the hair texture. It's a bit distracting, so just getting rid of some of that a bit more. I'm just accentuating some of the markings on this wolf's face. And by doing that with the texture comb rather than, say, a hard-edged round brush, you just really do hint at it being fur. Okay, rotating your piece to change up the direction of the brush strokes, and also gives you a good indication, again, like I was saying before, of if something's not looking right. You can often see it when something's upside down or rotated to the right or left, or flipping it, that you don't see when you're looking at it as is. So all of this at the moment is I'm working on the main image layer. The hot edges layer is still above this one. I've not flattened that in yet, just in case I need to go in and neaten up some of those edges on the nose, ears and the eyes. just putting some of the darker fur in around this wolf's head. I tend to do a lot of animal illustrations on my websites. I actually put that I'm a wildlife illustrator because I just time and time again come back to doing animals, love animals. And it's good as an illustrator if you can find a niche. It's a lot easier to market yourself rather than a everything to all people illustrator. If you can create a niche for yourself and become the go-to person for that sort of work, then people will find you. Eventually you'll make a name for yourself. And when you're approaching art directors, you may feel that it's narrowing your client base by only doing one particular type of illustration on one subject, but it just makes it easier when you're marketing yourself, because you make sure that you're just targeting those specific people that will be interested in your type of work, rather than sending out a blanket approach, say a postcard mailing or something to every art director you find in your Writers and Artists yearbook. You just go for those ones that really would use your work, so you'll save yourself time and money by only targeting those people. Of course, I'll let you know how all this works or doesn't work in the blog. So I'll certainly be putting down my mistakes that I make along the way as well, which is just as important as any successes I might have. And also got a sign up for the newsletter option on my blog, and I'll be putting together newsletters, and my plan is to actually include my earnings in there. So I'm going to be quite transparent about all of that sort of stuff, because it's important. Myself and my wife got a baby on the way, and so I need to be able to make a certain amount of money from this, and in the sort of quickest time possible. And so I think it's important to let other aspiring illustrators know, because I know I would like to know realistic earning potential, where they can support myself and my family through illustration. I'm lucky that I've got a freelance design business, marketing design business that I run with my wife, and so it's good to have a day job if you're wanting to make that transition to illustration. It's very hard just to make that leap immediately and quit your job. If you can do this and build up a client base, get some jobs in for your illustration while you've still got the day job. It may mean working at night, it may mean working all the weekends, but if it's what you want to do, then you just need to put the time in there. But it's certainly easier if you've got certainly in these economic times to have a day job. As you can see, making some marks here with a lighter, brighter white, using the texture comb still, and you can see just at the bottom of the screen there, the top of the wolf's head. Some nice fur bristling up there, showing the aggression of that guy. Because although I'm obviously raving about this texture comb brush, it's still very structured and could look repetitive if used too much. And so what I will do at the end is, when I'm doing some brighter highlights, I will just go with a very small, hard round edge brush, and with my my tablet pen set to pressure, so that whenever, if I press hard, I get a thicker line or a thinner line, I can go in and just pick out some individual strands of fur, just some highlights here and there, just to make the piece pop a little bit. I love doing those bits, it's always my favourite. Always a piece really comes alive when you do those. As you'll hopefully see when we get to that stage shortly. Okay, just his eyes have become a little bit blurred with the marks I've been making, so just going to pick those out a little bit again. And around the teeth and gums there as well. That just comes from working on minimal layers. You are going to end up painting over bits and pieces, so you just need to go in sometimes and just pick out those details again. As you can see there, the highlight's too bright, so I needed to take that out. Went in too early and with a highlight there. Okay, just finding a brush here that's it's not a hard edge round brush. I didn't want to be too harsh, so I just picked a chalk brush there and and then back to the hard edge brush just to pick out some of the lines around the nose, some of the highlights, and create the form of that nose, just highlights it a bit more. And again with the mouth as well. We're getting to the sort of final detailing now really. We're just going in and picking out those details. And as you can see here, I'm starting to put some of those lighter hairs in that I was talking about. Not too heavy-handedly, you want to be quite careful on this, otherwise you'll end up with these huge brush marks that you'll see and it will overpower the piece. So putting a little bit of a highlight on the nose there just to show that it's a shiny surface, a wet nose. And then putting in some of those finer hairs on the ears there. Just makes the piece pop a little bit. But all the while not wanting to going too over the top with this, and put too many in, otherwise it'll be too distracting for the piece. And this is where zooming in and out comes in handy. You can see if you've gone in and you've done too many highlights, because the highlights will be all you'll be able to see, and you don't want that. You want it to accentuate what you've done, not overpower it. Putting in some highlights on the gums there to show that it's a shiny wet surface, and on the bottom lip. Putting some hairs around, some lighter hairs. I think this guy has been my favourite one to work on here actually. The bit of the illustration I'm most pleased with. Just where that's the fluke of picking up that texture comb brush and using that for the piece, which I never intended to do. I just sort of went as I went along with the piece, looking for brushes that would work, and picked on this one, and I'm pleased with it. It's worked really well. Again, is picking the right brush for the right piece. Might use that again on something else and it just wouldn't work at all, but in this instance it's worked quite well for the subject matter. So nearly there. Now it's picking out some of the highlights around the mouth. Some of the edges I'm happy to let blend into the background, and then other ones I need to pick out a little bit more. Okay, so we're just about done now. Just picking out a few more areas. You have to be careful, you need to know when to stop. I've got pieces where I've got really carried away and I've just gone on and on and on, I've ended up ruining it. So you want to do just enough with the highlights so you have a good tonal range. So again, now where I'm happy for the neck below the mouth there to blend into the background on the top of his head, I wanted to highlight it a bit just to pick it out. Okay, putting the final highlights on this guy's nose. Picking out his eyes. He had really starey eyes in the reference that I've got, so wanted to accentuate that. He's actually, I think, on the prowl, hunting, which is why his head's low and his back's up, hunches are up. Going in with a little bit of black there just to pick certain areas out. He had quite distinctive markings on the sort of between his ears and on his nose going up to his sort of forehead. Okay, so that's all the detailing done, so I'll flatten those. One thing I wanted to pick out in from the references, I love the wolf's eyes when they have the deep amber eyes or the icy blue eyes, and so I wanted to really pick those out. First of all, I'm just putting some whiskers in, actually, which is one other thing that I noticed. I thought I'd completed the piece, but then I did have to go back in and add some whiskers. And this is the beauty of the drawing tablet, because having that pressure sensitivity, as if you're using a real pencil, sort of pressing down to get a darker line or a thicker line, and not pressing down so hard for the thinner lines. It works so well, something you can't do with a mouse. And as I say here, just putting in those whiskers and keeping them quite random, but it's just something that would be very difficult to achieve with a mouse, if not impossible. Although some guys do use the mouse for their digital illustrations, and they get some amazing effects. So I'm just adding a few more of these whiskers in. That's about it there. Okay, so then flatten my layers, or merge the layers, and I go onto the background layer. The top layer that I've flattened is set to multiply, so that I can then go into the layer below and start to put in some colour to show the eyes. So that's what you can see I'm doing here. So I'm essentially painting below the actual painting, so you can see it through. Multiply is one of my favourite layer modes, because it just allows you to do so much. Colouring underneath images, where there's a pen and ink drawing that you take into Photoshop, and you put that pen and ink drawing onto multiply and then draw underneath, and so we're pretty much there now. So the last thing I'd like to do is just sharpen the edges a little bit more and reduce that fade. You don't want it to be too harsh, but it's nice to sharpen and it makes the image sing, and that's about it. But thanks for watching. I hope it's been useful.